Hi, welcome to this month's research forum. We're just going to wait a few minutes. We usually start at about 12:02 to get everybody a chance to show up that intends to be here today. So it'll just be a few minutes and then we'll get started. Thank you for your patience. Well, good afternoon and welcome to at least a virtual representation of Wilson Library. And this is one of our monthly research forums. What the research forum represents for us is something that's pretty exciting. We have a number of fellowship programs that actually support research in our library using our special collections. And one sort of thing that we demand of them, in addition to using and making good use of our collections and writing really interesting things, is that they come back and they talk to us about what it is that they've discovered, what their experience was like. So this is really an exciting moment for us to allow us to learn a little bit more about our collections and, more importantly, how our collections interact with the broader scholarly community. So as you know, when you registered, there are two speakers that are going to be here with us today. There's going to be Carter Kurtz, who's going to proceed first, and then there'll be Emily Martin. Um, just in way of a short introduction to Carter, and she'll be speaking for about a half hour, and then Emily will speak for a half hour, and then we'll come together for questions. So if you could hold your questions or even put them in the chat, but knowing that we'll come back to them at the end, we'll be fine. So Carter Kurtz is a sixth-year PhD candidate in religious studies here at UNC. And her work focuses on the intersection between madness, whiteness, and religion in the 19th and 20th, I'm sorry, in the 19th century South. During her fellowship, which was something called a Southern Studies doctoral fellowship that was funded really generously by the J. Carlisle Sitterson Fund for Southern History, during her fellowship, Carter worked on two really large, important collections that have been within our, this is the exciting thing, right? These collections have been with us in Wilson Library for close to 100 years. These are longstanding collections, but everybody looks at them in new and sort of exciting ways. So she spent most of her time with something called the Cameron family papers and something called the Mordecai family papers. These are two interconnected families who both had daughters that were institutionalized in Raleigh. Her work today is drawn from one of her dissertation chapters on the life of Anna Mackenzie Cameron Kirkland. And this is a chapter that heavily drew on archival resources here in Wilson Library. So without further ado, Carter, welcome.
Hello, thank you, Matt. All right, let me get set up here with sharing screen and everything going. It take a second to load. Hopefully you all can see that there. Is that good for everyone? We have a yes there. Okay. So, hello. Like Matt said, this portion of this presentation I'm going to be giving today is a portion of one of my chapters of my forthcoming dissertation. I'm very excited to share it with you today, titled "This House of Refuge: Anna Mackenzie Kirkland, Madness and Religious Discipline." While 19th century U.S. historians have long recognized the insane asylum and the home as sites for disciplining citizens, the relationship between them and how both used religion to shape their residents remains underexplored. Today, I will argue that the Southern home and asylum employed religion in synergistic, yet sometimes contradictory, ways in an attempt to discipline their subjects into model citizens. Ultimately, religious practice within both the home and the asylum was shaped by antebellum Southern elites' belief in their own class and racial supremacy. Following on the experiences of Anna Mackenzie Kirkland, niece of the aristocratic North Carolina slave owner Duncan Cameron, I will demonstrate how religious discipline functioned first at home and later within the asylum. By tracing the continuities and tensions between the highly emotional religion she learned at home and the quote-unquote real religion enforced in the asylum, Anna's story reveals how both institutions sought to construct an internalized panopticon, which I'll talk more about here in just a second, or internal system of surveillance, using faith to regulate mind and body in accordance with the demands of Southern paternalism. This paper provides a bird's eye view of a chapter of my forthcoming dissertation, as I mentioned. Okay, so this is an image of Air Mount in Hillsborough, North Carolina, which is just outside of the Chapel Hill area. A really wonderful place to come visit if you ever have time. Highly recommend. Though much of the research on the antebellum home focuses on the North, Southerners wrote regularly and affectionately of home, even though their understanding of the ideal home was different from their Northern counterparts. And there are fascinating examples of this in the Wilson, in both the Cameron and Mordecai family papers, examples of individuals writing about how they were so eager to come home, or they were eager to make sure that their family members made it safely home, all of this sort of terminology. And I should also mention as well that Air Mount in Hillsborough is where the Kirkland family lived, and where Anna, when she married into the Kirkland family, ended up living for a while as well. She's actually buried there at Air Mount. Now, often the South's peculiar institution, slavery, was responsible for these differences in the meaning of home. Slavery, in turn, distinguished Southern gender relations. In the North, while the ideology of separate spheres was increasingly segregating women's domestic space from the masculine world of commerce, the central importance of the plantation household to the slave economy prevented it from ever assuming a purely domestic private role. Additionally, the patriarchal structure that upheld white racial dominance could not completely give over this key economic site to women without undermining itself. As such, men retained much more authority in Southern than Northern homes. Scott Stephen, a scholar of religious studies, observed that Southern religion, and especially evangelicalism, bolstered women's domestic standing to some degree, especially on religious matters. This meant that Christian teaching, while insisting on female subservience to men, also authorized women to use religion to discipline their households. Such discipline involved regular church attendance, Bible reading, prayer, and the inculcation of a sense of self-discipline to help one avoid sin in everyday life. This disciplining effectively instilled in children an internalized panopticon. First proposed by Jeremy Bentham, the panopticon, meaning an all-seeing structure, was an idealized model prison in which cells were arranged so that inmates were always visible to a guard in the central tower. The guard could see any prisoner at any time from this tower. You can see a drawing representation of this here, and an example of this at the abandoned Presidio Modelo in Cuba that was inspired by Bentham's model here with the central tower, right? And the ability to look into all of the cells. They're all oriented around the central tower there. However, the inmates could not determine whether and when the guard, if any, within that central tower, was observing them, and thus necessitated that they always act as if they were being watched. Right? So this is the physical panopticon. In the internalized panopticon of the Christian home, the first guard in the tower was the mother, who acted as disciplinarian, soon replaced by the masculine figures she claimed to represent, namely the familial patriarch, it could be the father or the uncle or whoever, right? The state, and finally, God. A correctly socialized child, or a child that had been raised correctly within this model, would ultimately police their own behavior according to the principles first outlined by the mother, and, in so doing, become a model citizen, capable of exercising self-discipline in the absence of all but godly authority. So even when nobody was looking, they would still behave in a way that ideally still reflected these values that they had learned originally from their mother, right? For pious mothers, instilling religious discipline was a divine calling, and these women felt personally responsible for the future state of their children's souls. Nancy Cameron's efforts to install piety in her daughter, Anna, exemplify how one Southern home functioned as a site of religious discipline. Anna Mackenzie Cameron was born in 1817 in Petersburg, Virginia, just outside of Richmond, to Anne, nicknamed Nancy, Carl Cameron, and William Cameron. William's brother, Duncan, would go on to head one of the largest slave-owning households in North Carolina. And of course, the Cameron family papers here at the Wilson Library are arranged around primarily Duncan's letters and personal correspondences and business notes, and also his son, Paul C. Cameron. He would go on to head one of the largest slave-owning households in North Carolina. Anna was around 9 years old when her father, William, died, leaving Nancy widowed with 7 children to care for. Like many other devout mothers, Nancy turned to her faith to help her rear her children into model citizens. Widowhood was common, and by necessitating women's reliance on male relatives in the state, generally reinforced rather than challenged patriarchal authority. And there are numerous letters sent between Duncan and Nancy, and also Nancy and her father, Daniel Call of Virginia, in which Nancy is seeking financial assistance or advice. Nancy was very much financially reliant on her male relatives, and these letters that are exchanged back and forth are sometimes referred to as female begging letters because of the significance of these women needing to rely on their male family members to support them financially because, of course, they struggled to have ways to bring in income themselves. Despite this reliance, women generally still oversaw children's upbringing. Some widows found religious discipline especially helpful in accomplishing this task, as it offered a substitute patriarch, God, for fatherless children to orient themselves around. This was especially important in the South, where all hierarchies revolved around white patriarchal authority. Such authority necessitated that well-adjusted children, especially girls, form a concept of self ultimately rooted in male guardianship, earthly or divine. Here we have an image of a letter that I'm going to speak about here in just a minute. That is a photo from the Cameron family papers here at the Wilson. While there are no letters that detail the specifics of Nancy's childbearing practices, her correspondence shows how she used her faith to console and exhort her family during times of trouble, both for children and adults, who are always children in relationship to God. Quote, "My dear brother," she wrote Duncan in 1845 in response to a family member's death, "afflictions we know are sent in mercy, and the true Christian will humbly kiss the rod that smites." End quote. Such writing exemplifies religion's disciplinary function, here serving to console and chastise both Nancy and Duncan alike in their grief. Nancy uses biblical imagery to make her point. The rod that smites alludes to Isaiah 11:4, wherein the Messiah judges the world and punishes the unrighteous for their sins. It also alludes to the familial relationship all believers have with God, who, like the loving father described in Proverbs 13:24, did not spare his children the rod. Such physical discipline of children would not have been merely symbolic to Nancy or Duncan, as popular wisdom upheld corporal punishment as legitimate and even obligatory in the raising of good Christian children. So this was expected as part of the child rearing process. There would be some degree of physical discipline, right? Nancy's daughter, Anna, was proof of the effectiveness of religious discipline in instilling piety and self-control. Phoebe Kirkland of Hillsborough described her future sister-in-law as, quote, "a very amiable lady and a devoted, pious one," end quote. Anna later used this religious discipline she had learned from her mother to make sense of her husband Alexander's early death. But rather than reinforce model citizenship and a normative or socially appropriate response to grief, Anna's piety became fuel for dramatic attempts at self-abasement or self-harm. In the eyes of those around her, Anna's religious discipline had become pathological, and only admission to an insane asylum could turn her irrational and non-normative religious convictions into rational and normative ones, more suited to model citizenship. But before we return to Anna, we need to understand how superintendents viewed the role of religion in the asylum. Though much of the history of the asylum and the asylum reform movement is rooted in religion, superintendents often approach the topic of religious practice within asylum walls with some hesitancy. Amariah Brigham of New York, one of the most influential of the first generation of asylum superintendents, wrote in his Observations on the Influence of Religion that religion was a common cause of insanity throughout history. Obviously, this was a pretty inflammatory perspective, right? Likewise, an 1845 article in the American Journal of Insanity, or the AJI, warned clergy that protracted religious meetings could cause, quote, "an excitement bordering on disease. We ourselves may be more sensitive upon this subject than others," the writers confess, as they had patients who were among the most worthy and pious in the land, end quote, before descending into madness. Superintendents were clearly concerned with the damaging influence of unfettered religion on the psyche. Despite this ambivalence toward religion, many institutions offered religious services to their patients. In 1840, Dr. Pliny Earle claimed that only 4 asylums in the United States failed to provide religious services to their residents. However, these services were under the tight control of the superintendent, the chief patriarch of the home for the insane. The asylum needed to offer its fragile and excitable residents only what the editors of the AJI called quote unquote real religion on account of its quote happy tendency to calm the mind, end quote. Such religion eschewed raucous and enthusiastic displays of religious passion, especially that were being seen in like revival and evangelical movements at this time, which asylum superintendents, along with many other fellow elites, associated with a dangerous lack of self-control. Instead, real religion focused on topics such as love, duty, submission, and forgiveness, which produced, quote, joy and peace in believing and in the prospect of heaven, end quote. In other words, it was a religion of assurance, not damnation. Real religion was just as much denominational as it was doctrinal, and the denominations most favored by superintendents in the Upper South were Episcopalianism, often associated with the upper classes and social respectability, and Presbyterianism, the latter reflecting the predominance of Scottish ancestry among the Southern aristocracy. So, and Anna's family actually was Episcopalian as well, as were many other wealthy families in the area, actually including many members of the Mordecai family, while originally born into a Jewish household, did end up converting to Episcopalianism later in life as they moved sort of up the social ladder. So, however, asylum superintendents were largely unconcerned with the intricacies of denominational theology. They didn't really care about all of the little debates between different groups. Their interest in religion was much more practical and temporal, that is focused on the world as it is here, right? Not in the afterlife or in heaven or something like that. They were not interested in saving souls, but about remolding non-normative subjects into model citizens. In other words, for superintendents, religion was a means to an end. It was unthinkable to deny patients religion altogether, and managed appropriately, such services could function as a spiritual extension of the asylum's more temporal methods of control, such as regular exercise and divisions into sex-specific wards, or different parts of the asylum building, right, segregated by sex. Additionally, as asylums grew in size, as their patient numbers grew over 200 patients, it became increasingly difficult to maintain constant surveillance. It was difficult for the staff to keep an eye on all the patients all of the time. Try as superintendents might, they could not make the asylum building into that perfect benthamite panopticon that we talked about earlier. But they could, as in the home, use religious discipline to reinforce the panopticon in the patient's mind. Before the Civil War, most asylum superintendents believed that unhealthy environments and behaviors were the leading cause of insanity. Treating insanity, then, required a healthy environment and more appropriate behavior. The physical structure of the asylum provided the first ingredient, but instilling good behavior was more difficult. While strict routines and schedules could help patients acquire new habits, these, just like the physical structure of the asylum, were really only good so long as the patient was there in the building, right? Religion, on the other hand, if managed carefully, could encourage more self-control in wayward patients, even after they exited the asylum, right? Could help them to manage life outside the asylum walls, and could serve remedially for patients whose insanity was rooted, as the superintendent saw it, in the improper construction of their internal panopticon during childhood, right, which usually put a lot of blame on the mother. As such, asylum superintendents took it upon themselves to facilitate appropriate religious discipline in their patients despite their ambivalence about the relationship between religion and madness. If the asylum offered the correct kind of religious services and instilled in patients the correct kind of religious conduct and thought, this real religion could help the superintendent to control and instill self-discipline in his charges. Religious discipline, then, could be similarly employed by superintendents as it was in the home. Both reinforced the power of the patriarchal figure and the patriarchal social structure as a whole. And for pious patients like Anna Mackenzie Kirkland, such religious discipline was remedial, allowing the superintendent, acting as the substitute patriarch, to repair a faulty mental panopticon and return it to working order. So we return to Anna here. Anna Mackenzie Kirkland was admitted to the Western State Lunatic Asylum in Stanton, Virginia, in 1846. She would later end up in the North Carolina asylum, but first she goes to this asylum in Stanton, Virginia, before the North Carolina asylum was even built. North Carolina was pretty late, actually, in building an asylum. So she was brought to this asylum in 1846, following the early death of her husband, Alexander. Anna believed that Alexander's death was punishment sent from God for her idolatry. Anna had, as she later wrote, worshipped her husband. I have this letter here, where I have this quote. She says, "How I worshipped him." And this wonderful letter, I mean, it's quite emotionally intense, but this very long letter that Anna writes to her uncle Duncan from the asylum there in Stanton is in the Cameron family papers there at in the Wilson, that I would highly recommend you take a look at. It's very interesting. And Anna's handwriting is pretty good, all things considered, so it's pretty legible. Anna said, "I forgot the kind benefactor who had given me such a blessing," of her husband, she admitted, "and madly thought love as strong as mine could stay the hand of death." Anna's language regarding her condition reflected that of many Southern evangelical women who feared that too much affection for their loved ones could bring forth the wrath of a jealous God. Believing herself guilty of a grievous sin, and without a patriarch to guide her, Anna turned to her faith, and what had once been a source of comfort became a source of self-mortification. Anna's methods of self-harm, while abnormal to those around her, resembled those inflicted by Christian devout for centuries. She dug her nails into her palms, possibly in the imitation of the wounds of Christ on the cross. These are called the stigmata, usually, and refused food completely, or that which she deemed luxurious. She denied herself sleep, and when she did not, she insisted upon sleeping on the floor, asserting that she, quote, was unworthy of the comforts furnished her, end quote. At times, she contemplated suicide, a condition that likewise stalked evangelicals during the First Great Awakening. While not at risk of ending her own life, Anna became fixated with the predictions of the deaths of herself and her two sons. While Dr. Francis Stribling, the asylum superintendent at Western, seems to have been largely uninterested in the greater religious significance behind this performance of self-injury, he recorded her conviction that any reduction in such self-restriction would, quote, increase her future suffering. In other words, she expected to have to suffer more in the afterlife, in hell, for her perceived sins if she did not punish herself in this life. Right? In fact, Stribling likely disregarded the symbolic significance of Anna's behavior to avoid validating it further. And again, in the Cameron family papers here, you can actually see much of the correspondence from one side of these letters that were sent between the Cameron and Kirkland family and Dr. Stribling here in the Cameron family papers here at the Wilson. But there are some other letters that are located at the Library of Virginia in Richmond. Such a paternalistic attitude toward patients' delusions was commonplace among superintendents, and they consciously self-identified as the patriarchs of the asylum. And again, we have an image here of Superintendent Stribling and what was called the Lunatic Asylum at Stanton, Virginia, here from the 1860s is when that postcard was made. If patients could trust and if necessary, fear the superintendent like a father, they were usually easier to manage. In this role, he could more successfully take his place as the guard within the patient's internal panopticon and thus remold the patient into a model citizen. Anna, having lost her father at a young age and later her husband, was especially receptive to such patriarchal authority. Writing to her other substitute father, Duncan Cameron, she declared that, quote, "You could not have placed me in wiser and kinder hands than his," adding that few have commanded my respect and esteem as he does, end quote, and describing the asylum as a house of refuge, which is a biblical reference. Anna's affection for Stribling was not idiosyncratic, it was not strange. Female patients described other superintendents as, quote, like a father, end quote. And historian Nancy Tomes has suggested that this paternal dynamic may have been particularly soothing to women reared to depend on male guidance. This claim to paternal authority shaped religious discipline in the asylum in two ways. First, the superintendent as patriarch or sort of father figure, his absolute power placed subordinates, that means patients and staff alike, into a feminized role. This was especially true of asylum chaplains and visiting preachers, right? So ministers that worked with the asylum, whose services helped relieve the superintendent of the need to personally minister to his patient's spiritual needs. He has too many other things to do, he can't deal with that, right? So he's got to sort of outsource it. The superintendent, as patriarch, could thus delegate religious discipline to the minister, who played this motherly role almost, just as the father could pass responsibility for religious discipline to the mother in the idealized Southern home. Second, this authority allowed him to exercise ultimate control over the religious discipline of his children, patients, right? Kind of both in this framework, right? Even as he offloaded labor onto the minister who's playing the role of the mother here. In this way, superintendent simultaneously claimed the territory of the minister and the patient's mother. So the superintendent is sort of implying that he has authority over these domains that is more important than the wishes of the minister or the preacher, and also more important than the wishes of the mother, right? Because he is the father figure here, right? So his will sort of supersedes or covers theirs, right? The superintendent's concern for the patient's constitution, combined with a strong belief in his own expertise, overrode the preacher and the patient's mother's wishes and values in favor of his own. Superintendents claimed that this ultimate control was medically necessary to restore the patient's sanity and to turn him or her into a model citizen. By demoting the other gods in the tower to the status of lesser officers, again, that mother and minister there, the superintendent asserted what he saw as his rightful place in the central tower of the patient's internal panopticon, where he could attempt to control the environmental and behavioral, or attempt to correct, the environmental and behavioral flaws he attributed to the home and religion, that is, the mother and the minister, respectively. So that's all very complicated, but we'll talk through this here. So, and this is an image of the chapel at the Western State Lunatic Asylum that was built in 1851. It is actually currently not available to view if you go to the site of the asylum now, but this is an image of that there. For Anna, what we've just discussed here, this meant replacing her mother's religious discipline with one that was more subdued, more chilled out, less, emotionally excitable, right? And real, right? As that real religion concept kind of points to. That is one that the superintendent deemed normative or acceptable and more suitable for her class position, right? So she needed to, as a member of these sort of upper class families, she couldn't be engaging in this kind of emotional, excitable religious fervor. She needed to be much more calm and reserved, and that's exactly what Superintendent Stribling and superintendents like him were trying to instill in Anna and patients like her, right? At Western, Anna attended services led by visiting local Presbyterian and Episcopal ministers, attended Bible classes, and read aloud from prayer books, activities she found especially fulfilling. And again, you can find those letters of her writing to her family here, and we have an excerpt from that. She writes a letter to her cousin, Margaret Cameron Mordecai. So that's actually the wife of George Washington Mordecai, whose papers are also at the Wilson there. Anna confessed that she had, quote, one of my crazy notions to join the Presbyterian Church, before qualifying characteristically, as she always says in many of these letters, if I could possibly outlive the fatal 25th of May, end quote. So unfortunately for Stribling, as you can tell from what she's talking about there, that Anna still has these obsessions, right? Despite attending all of these services, despite engaging in these sort of respectable denominational practices of Presbyterians and Episcopalians, Anna is still quite excitable, right? And still worried about her future, right? And believing that she was going to be inevitably damned on this date, this time the fatal 25th of May. And I actually don't know what the significance of that date is in this context, although I know that another date that she mentions at one point happens to be the anniversary of her marriage to Alexander. But unfortunately for Stribling, Anna's own denominational upbringing as an Episcopalian was too similar to that was being offered in the asylum. So at least in name and in practice, even though what her mother was teaching her was a little bit more excitable, right? She still saw both of them as Episcopalian, and so she didn't really see a big difference between these two. She didn't see it as disciplinary, really. It was just reinforcing kind of what she already believed, right? It was too similar to that on offer in the asylum for the services to actively challenge her outlook on the state of her own soul. So we'll conclude things here. While the regimen of religious discipline at the asylum did not permanently cure Anna Kirkland, She was admitted to the newly opened North Carolina Asylum in Raleigh a decade later with similar fixations. It nonetheless provides us with an example of how asylum superintendents put into practice their ideas about the proper role of religion, so-called real religion, in the asylum. And I'll note that North Carolina asylum in Raleigh that Anna ends up at later, is not only are some of the papers about that also here at the Wilson, but that's actually, if you know about Dix Park in Raleigh, that is the previous site of the hospital there that was later renamed Dix Hospital. It was a mental hospital that was there for a long time. That was the original North Carolina asylum for the insane in Raleigh. And of course, it no longer exists there. That name Dix, coming from Dorothea Dix, who was an asylum reformer, very popular, helped to encourage the North Carolina Assembly to build that asylum in the first place. And again, some letters actually between George Washington Mordecai and Dorothea Dix can be found at the Wilson in the George Washington Mordecai papers. As we have seen, the ideal Southern home served as a model for relationships within the asylum and for how the asylum used religion to shape its residents into model citizens. Meanwhile, the superintendent's autocratic position in the asylum, combined with his expertise, granted him patriarchal power that, in theory, allowed him to override the authority of the preacher and the mother to take control of the central tower of the patient's internal panopticon. This would allow him to rehabilitate them into model citizens, according to the superintendent's ideas of what constituted normal behavior. In the context of religious discipline, the superintendent's class position and regional background shaped these ideals just as much as his occupational training. Ultimately, Anna's class position blunted the efficacy of this effort. The asylum's real religion was too similar in appearance to the elite piety she had learned at home to fundamentally challenge her pathological guilt, even as she accepted Stripling as a patriarchal figure. And Anna's experience in the Southern home and asylum gives us a firsthand look at how these institutions, the ideals for these institutions, oftentimes did not match their realities, but nonetheless functioned as mutually reinforcing, if sometimes oppositional, sites of religious discipline that sought to transform their charges into model citizens. Well, we're not going to be doing questions right now. We're going to hold on that. I do want to show you this picture here of Western's main building, again in Stanton, Virginia. It is now the Blackburn Inn, and you actually would not know that it was an insane asylum previously. They just referred to it as a hospital. But it is there, and you can go inside and look around. And I do have photos from that as well that I'm happy to share with you all at another time. But it's certainly an interesting historical thing there. So Anna was there at that building. So, all right. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Carter. I look forward to the questions and talking a little more with you. Despite the best efforts of my colleague, Nadia Clifton, I did neglect to say at the top of the show that for those of you that are have questions about CLE credits, that at the end of our talk today, there'll be a QR code that you can use. So that's forthcoming. Now we're going to talk with Emily Martin, and just a quick bio to sort of catch you all up on who Emily is. Emily is a PhD candidate in history at the University of California, Berkeley, and she's currently working on her dissertation, Serving Sickness, Diet and Racial Susceptibility to Disease, 1850 to 1940, which examines how public health officials in the 19th and 20th century understood diet as a predisposing cause of disease. Emily's research here was also funded by a specific fund because her work is very much sort of focused on the practice or the past practice of medicine. We have a fund called the McClendon Thomas Award, which is funded by the Bullet Club Founders Endowment. And we're grateful for that because almost every year it seems that people are greatly interested in looking at sort of medical practice through a historiographical framework. So anyway, Emily, without further ado.
Great. Good morning and good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. And thank you, Matt, Nadia, and the rest of the library staff for having me today. I'm going to talk a bit about my ongoing dissertation progress, which is currently titled Serving Sickness, Diet and Racial Susceptibility to Disease. I want to start quickly with an overview of the project, some of the big picture historiographic stakes. I'm going to talk really quickly about two of my case studies, plague in San Francisco and tuberculosis on Great Plains Native American reservations as some background context. And then I'll spend the back half of the presentation talking about pellagra in the South, which was the subject of my research at the Wilson and will be the bulk of this talk. So this project comes from a very persistent but kind of basic question. During an epidemic, why do some people get sick while others don't? During the COVID-19 pandemic, public health experts attempted to communicate certain risk factors for severe disease, diabetes, immune deficiencies, or obesity, but it was difficult predicting for whom the disease would be severe. And this difficulty and tension helped spread misinformation and create uncertainty. I argue in this dissertation that at the turn of the 20th century, dietary explanations of disease helped public health workers mitigate uncertainty and helped the public answer this question for themselves. In other words, physicians, public health workers, journalists, and lay observers alike repeatedly turned to diet as a predisposing secondary cause of disease. Diet did important conceptual work in explaining disease risk. It translated cultural stereotypes about food into scientific and often ostensibly race neutral explanations for differential susceptibility to disease. Rather than claiming inherent racial weakness, for example, officials could easily point to eating habits to explain why some communities seemed to get sick more often. And as I mentioned above, I think diet also helped manage uncertainty. The public health apparatus in the United States was still new in 1900. And in moments when disease causation was still being debated or was still unclear, diet often offered a stable, explanatory anchor. It was flexible enough to be adapted to a range of specific circumstances. And then finally, I think that focusing on food helped consolidate public health's power in intimate spaces, especially the home, under the guise of prevention. I coined the term alimentary risk to describe this logic, the idea that certain diets and eating practices more broadly made groups more susceptible to disease, even when they were widely understood not to be the direct cause of sickness. This logic played out across diverse settings, and my dissertation spans geographically distinct case studies to demonstrate that this pattern endured in different racial groups, for different diseases, and in different regions. I draw from a range of sources, medical journals, public health circulars, popular media, letters, state records, and personal ephemera in my investigation. I'm going to talk quickly about two of these case studies, pellagra in San Francisco and tuberculosis in Sioux communities in the Great Plains. And then I end the dissertation with pellagra. These four chapters, there's actually another one, are meant to show that diet functioned as a sincerely held explanatory model, as well as a politically flexible tool that enabled physicians to advance claims of racial susceptibility to certain diseases while managing public skepticism towards the nascent public health system. As I'll cover in greater detail later in the talk, I think pellagra is a very unique case that complicates this framework in some interesting ways. So historians often treat diet as a subset of sanitation politics. One of my primary interventions for this project is trying to show that diet deserves separate analytical attention. Sanitation's often tied to space, to streets, to buildings, to neighborhoods, whereas diet, by contrast, is often tied to individuals and to households. While questions of sanitary conditions definitely were about the home and did involve public health workers entering the home, I think they raise a different set of questions about health practices. Sanitary concerns are often very structural. Some sanitary problems can't be fixed except by landlords. But dietary concerns link very closely to individual behavior. If you can't fix the structure of your house, in other words, you can change what you're eating. I think diet's also interesting because it occupies this kind of unstable position between individual choice and collective practice. It might be framed as something people choose, but those choices are often deeply enculturated. What you choose to eat depends on where you live, where you're from, what's available to you, often your racial and ethnic identity and personal taste. I, for example, grew up eating ham loaf and collard greens because my family's from Pittsburgh, but we grew up in the South. So this all makes diet really powerful politically. I think it allowed public health workers to invoke the language of individual responsibility for disease burden while maintaining its core connection to very loaded racial and ethnic categories. This allowed public health workers to evoke racial categories without explicitly naming race or getting into the fraught and contentious debate over race science that's going on at the turn of the 20th century. I think this duality is what makes diet a durable and significant explanatory category that can't be easily covered by just thinking of it as like sanitation a bit to the left. Um, I think diet is also really interesting because it fits so neatly into the period's shifting understanding of disease origins, appealing often both to lay understandings of disease and to professional scientific theory. Diet has long enjoyed a central role in understanding individual health. Humoral medicine, the prevailing medical theory from the ancient Roman period until roughly the 19th century, often emphasized that diet was the best way to keep the four humors in balance and was often the first line of defense when illness appeared. Germ theory, the predominant theory from the 1880s onward, meanwhile, saw food still as essential to disease cause, but instead pointed to it as a vector of disease where food could now spread bacteria. But this never erased those associations where food could be also a sign of constitutional weakness, where malnutrition might make your body more susceptible to germs or bacteria that you're exposed to. Scholars often look to germ theory as a paradigm shift in medical thought. But when evaluating the relationship between medicine and food, I think this period is actually one of surprising continuity. Part of the reason why these dietary explanations survive changes in medical theory is because they move so easily between the individual and collective register, allowing for individuals to explain their own health and allowing public health to frame health challenges broadly. I think to understand this look, again, we can think about the present moment where the Make America Healthy Again movement has focused overwhelmingly on diet as a possible cause of a whole range of chronic and acute health challenges facing people in the United States. Historians also focus frequently on debates over disease etiologies when studying this time period. But I think diet is often a point of commonality even in these debates, whether debating miasmatic causes versus bacterial ones, bacterial versus deficiency explanations, environmental versus constitutional. Diet was often used by both parties in those conflicts to explain susceptibility to disease. Another interesting point here is that this link between diet and disease often exists outside of, quote, like Western biomedical science. And versions of this link are found in indigenous medical thought, Chinese medicine, and many other global areas of medical practice and medical folk practice. So the groups targeted by public health often had their own beliefs about diet and disease. So to shift to my first case study, bubonic plague in San Francisco, I argue that diet was one of the primary ways that different groups understood disease risk and contested or justified the actions of the State Board of Health. The existence of bubonic plague was hotly contested. The Democratic city government insisted that the plague was present, and thus it justified extraordinary measures of confinement. But the Republican state administration denied the existence of plague for economic reasons. And meanwhile, much of the city's Chinese merchant class also denied the existence of plague in the interest of the Chinese community. So all of these groups reference diet to explain and legitimize their understanding of the health crisis in the city. This wasn't just a case of science versus anti-science, but it was one of competing conceptions over what the link between disease and food meant in San Francisco. So U.S. Surgeon General Walter Wyman, probably the nation's preeminent public health expert, in a circular on bubonic plague that was sent out to all of the country's federal quarantine officers, linked high mortality rates in Hong Kong's plague outbreak to Chinese dietary practices and to a rice-heavy vegetarian diet. Meanwhile, the pro Board of Health SF Examiner echoed this explanation when justifying the public health's focus exclusively on San Francisco's Chinatown. They explained it's universally recognized that the bubonic plague seizes with great eagerness on persons who have been inadequately fed or who have been fed upon such products as rice and fish, in opposition to those who, like the majority of Anglo-Americans, are meat eaters. This logic helped support the Board of Health's decision to quarantine all of Chinatown. So the city's Chinese merchant class likewise affirmed that poor diet and vegetarianism were linked to plague. They were never actually disputing that, but they emphasized that the American Chinese community was actually eating a very meat-heavy and well-balanced diet. So the city's only Chinese language newspaper, the Chinese Western Daily, explained that daily heavy labor without rest for life and only coarse grains and vegetables to allay hunger. The health of ordinary Chinese does deteriorate because of malnutrition, but in the United States, Chinese immigrants changed their diet to meat and fish, which Western sellers of chicken, duck, fish, and meat could testify to. So the legal challenge of quarantining only the city's Chinatown ended up centering around this question of food. A Chinese grocer, Zhu Ho, was the plaintiff in the case and argued in court filings that provisioning food to the district was actually a way of maintaining health, and the city had stopped him from being able to provision food to the district. Chinese community prevails in court. Quarantine was struck down, emphasizing how diet was used both to marginalize the city's Chinese community and justify the quarantine as a potential health threat, but was ultimately flexible enough to push back on the actions of the Board of Health. The tuberculosis crisis on Native American reservations sparked, I think, a similar debate over the role of diet in causing health crises among marginalized communities. Tuberculosis at this point in time was understood to be a bacterial condition, but it was really strongly connected to poor diet. If you were alive in 1900, most individuals living in the United States could expect to be exposed to tuberculosis, likely many times over the course of your life, but odds of actually contracting the disease, becoming sick from it, or dying from it varied widely by community. So by 1928, the publication of this document called the Miriam Report on the Problem of Indian Administration, the problem in Native American communities was substantial. Upwards of 30% of all fatalities on most reservations were caused by tuberculosis, and TB rates were typically 3 to 6 times higher than even in the hardest hit white communities. With few exceptions, diet among Native Americans was considered to be bad. Quote, it is generally insufficient in quantity, lacking in variety, and poorly prepared. The lack of milk, meat, and fresh produce across the diets of most Native families was conducive to, quote, the development and spread of disease, including and especially tuberculosis. Federal government played an outsized role in the response here, owing to treaty obligations that bound the federal government to provide for certain communities. Among the Sioux, the government was bound by the Treaty of Fort Laramie to provide both food and medical care. Increasingly, the government understood this medical obligation as being tied to the food obligation because diet was linked so heavily to tuberculosis. Well, the government understood the reservation system probably was responsible for the TB crisis. They consistently blamed this failure not on the system itself, but on the failure of Native communities to adapt to Anglo-American foodways. Rather than blaming the poor or spoiled rations, they blamed Native people for failing to use these rations to jumpstart farming practices. And where dietary rations did include vegetables or milk, which was typically pretty infrequent, they blamed Native people for refusing these foods because of personal taste. In order to target tuberculosis, the Bureau of Indian Affairs focused on food, and they institute this really elaborate system of surveillance, school rations, health guidance, and extension work to constantly police Native food practices. The preferred medical intervention in this case, thus, relied on dietary explanations that claimed that the Sioux were uniquely susceptible to TB. So what does this mean for pellagra? So pellagra is temporally the last case I'm looking at. It's also the last chapter of my dissertation, and it grew out of the research I conducted last summer at the Wilson Library, where I was working primarily with the papers of Joseph Goldberger, a U.S. Public Health Service officer whose career was synonymous practically with pellagra. I also looked at a range of contemporary books and pamphlets on the disease in the South and a number of other papers trying to get different perspectives on how different people understood the diets of poor white and African American communities in this time period. This chapter is very much still in development, and I have more research planned, particularly around extension work related to pellagra. What I'm presenting here is an outline of the argument based on the institutional perspective we get from Joseph Goldberger and thinking about how it fits alongside the framework we see in the case of plague or in the case of tuberculosis. Um, I'll say there's a lot of interesting stuff in the Goldberger papers, a lot of which won't make it into my dissertation because it deals with his personal relationship with his wife and family, but they are a really interesting collection of letters to look through. So when pellagra was first identified in the American South in 1906, contemporary observers linked the disease to diet almost immediately. It was also considered the region's greatest health problem and was described in one letter as the naughtiest, uh, and most urgent problem facing the U.S. Public Health Service. Pellagra seemed to plague places with corn-heavy diets almost exclusively, as in rural Italy and the American South. Researchers assumed that corn was implicated indirectly, perhaps through spoilage or fungal contamination, or that these diets simply predisposed people to this illness. In the early 20th century South, this association was often mapped onto African American sharecropping communities whose diets were typically the worst in the region and relied overwhelmingly on corn. A lot of this early theorization comes from writings by James Wood Badcock, who was considered an expert on pellagra before Goldberger comes onto the scene. But despite all of this investigation that's happening in the early 1900s and that was happening in the end of the 19th century in Italy, researchers completely failed to identify a specific bacterium or fungus that was responsible for pellagra. And they remained puzzled by why some members of a household or community who were in close contact with each other got sick while others didn't. Unlike tuberculosis or plague, where a bacterial cause had long been clearly identified, pellagra remained etiologically uncertain. In this context, diet was a central site of speculation and examination. Joseph Goldberger upends this paradigm, however, through a series of studies conducted in orphanages, asylums, and other institutions. He demonstrated that pellagra was not merely associated with diet, but was in fact a disease of nutritional deficiency. Rather than functioning simply as a predisposing factor to illness, the corn-based diet that was common among the South's poorest resident was the direct and sufficient cause of the disease. Therefore, nutritional improvement wasn't ancillary to treatment. It was actually the only cure that public health had at their disposal. Now, this wasn't the case for my other case studies. Even in the case of TB, where officials linked cure to dietary reform, diet was never the only tool of public health workers. Um, there's a couple of interesting things about pellagra and Goldberger's research that raise some kind of unique conceptual questions. Um, Goldberger was considered unusually progressive for a public health official of his era. He understood pellagra as fundamentally rooted in poverty and the economic structure of the South. Declining global cotton prices reduced sharecroppers' access to land for subsistence farming, while migration into mill towns and urban centers often further constrained diets because of reliance on poorly stocked company stores. As conditions worsened, pellagra increasingly appeared in white mill communities, making the disease more visible and more clearly associated with white populations as well as African American ones who bore the burden of the public perception of the disease in the very early 1900s. Goldberger's research overwhelmingly focused on white communities afflicted with pellagra, segregated orphanages and asylums, predominantly white mill towns. This focus shaped how diet was discussed in writings of the Public Health Service. Unlike in cases where public health interventions targeted dispossessed or colonized populations, in Goldberger's hands, dietary explanations were less moralized than I initially came into this project expecting. Goldberger didn't frame deficient diets as the result of individual choice. Instead, in his personal writings, he's emphasizing institutional food systems, prisons, orphanages, and mills as the sites where pellagra is produced. And he argued that disease would persist so long as the underlying economic conditions remain unchanged. At the same time, though, even as he's emphasizing that pellagra affects white communities, his explanations did so by implicitly aligning white diets with those of impoverished African American communities. I think there's this one really revealing incident I found in the archive that I'm trying to still like fit into this argument, which comes from an interaction between Goldberger and the governor of Mississippi. After Goldberger shared the results of his infamous study, inducing pellagra in a group of white prisoners who were offered pardons in exchange for their participation, the governor expressed surprise that pellagra would be dietary because he knew a senator who suffered from the disease, even though, as he put it, quote, he didn't eat Negro food, end quote. This comment underscores how deeply racialized ideas about diet persisted and were used to often challenge Goldberger's assertions about the dietary cause of the disease, even as pellagra is increasingly affecting white populations. So there is something that is very persistently racialized here, even if Goldberger is kind of resisting that racialization in his own research. Um, Now, despite his recognition of the disease's economic roots, the solution Goldberger embraces is largely technocratic and does often fit easily alongside some of these like other racial projects that are being undertaken. So he believed that pellagra would continue so long as poverty endured. He nevertheless devotes the latter half of his career to identifying whatever like vitamin is actually responsible for pellagra and to finding a cheap and scalable dietary supplement. Early in his career, he thought beans were the solution. This ends up not being the case. By the end of his career, he identified brewer's yeast as an effective, extremely cheap preventative or cure. Individuals suffering from pellagra sometimes wrote directly to him asking for access to this cure, which they couldn't often obtain or sometimes even afford, even though it was very, very cheap. I think the solution is kind of revealing for two reasons. First, I think it reflects a limited political will to confront the structural economic causes of the disease. And second, it actually does avoid the more coercive interventions seen in other contexts. There was no large-scale campaign to transform Southern diets wholesale, the way there was in the case of TB, only to supplement them. And in Goldberger's early writings, around 1913, he does suggest that people should change their diets to cut out corn, but this suggestion was extremely unpopular and largely unworkable and disappears from his writings by 1920. So public health officials lack the coercive authority they exercised on Native American reservations, where dietary change was imposed as part of a civilizing project. And the spillover of disease into highly visible white communities also makes the kind of rhetorical confinement practiced during the plague outbreak in SF, unviable. By centering pellagra in white communities, Goldberger undermined interpretations of the disease as a sign of racial backwardness or degeneracy, making the crisis, in his hands, less morally charged than in other case studies. Now, an interesting complicating factor is that Joseph Goldberger died relatively young, in 1929 at 54 years old, well before the disease is eradicated in the South. Um, he died before the 1937 discovery that vitamin B3 or niacin was responsible for the disease. His preference for supplementation as cure does eventually become state policy in the 1940s when niacin was added to corn and flour meal to avoid reappearance of the disease. But with him off of the scene, I think some of these racialized stories become more prominent, that there was never a clear elimination of them from the record, even though he's not really the one promoting them. I'm still working through materials at other archives that document the role of extension workers, especially those who were entering the homes of African American women to educate them about diet and convince them to change dietary practices to prevent pellagra. I'm really interested in how and to what extent these interventions reproduced racialized assumptions about diet and responsibility, and whether they complicate the story I've sketched out here. My current sense is that ideas of racial susceptibility do linger in the broader story, despite Goldberger's framing, especially when pellagra flares after the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. I'm curious how this maps onto public health action, though, compared to my other case studies, where public health often takes a very active interventionist approach with marginalized communities. This dissertation is still very much a work in progress. This pellagra chapter is the most in flux and unfinished right now. So I'd very much welcome any questions or thoughts anybody has. And thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Emily. That was really interesting. First, I want to open it up to anybody in the audience have a question that they'd like to ask. You could type it into the chat, or you could raise your hand and we could have you speak. Well, while you consider, I always have a couple of questions. The first one is actually to Emily because I was wholly unaware of the experimental nature of Goldberger's work, and I was hoping that you might be able to speak a little more with a little more detail about the prison experiment. I'm curious about this.
Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
that's probably the most controversial aspect of his work. He makes an agreement with Mississippi's governor for a group of like 8 prisoners, including prisoners who were convicted of like capital offenses, so people sentenced to life in prison, to voluntarily be subjected to this very limited diet of corn, molasses, and like pork fat, basically, to see if that would induce pellagra, which is not a disease you want to get, to be clear. It causes like dementia, gastrointestinal distress, and like a really bad skin rash that resembles a sunburn. Um, and in exchange for participation, they would be released from prison at the end of the like 6 month long experiment. All of the prisoners who participated in the experiment were white, and they were typically very well-connected prisoners, because this was actually considered like kind of a privilege to receive this pardon in exchange for like 6 months of eating like a pretty boring diet, was kind of how it was framed. So there are definitely ethical questions around like informed consent, but this becomes the proof that leads to more people accepting it. Previously, he worked at like orphanages mostly, where he would just like show, oh, all of the orphanages who feed this to their children have pellagra in these age groups, but younger kids who still receive milk or who receive more meat don't have pellagra, and none of the staff has pellagra. So that's like his first effort at showing people. And they're like, yeah, maybe. But it's not until he proves he can induce it by intentionally restricting diet that more people are willing to agree with it. And he does this with this group of very politically well-connected white prisoners in Mississippi. So
And
that's kind of interesting.
yeah, and do all of them develop it? Is it a very high percentage? I'm just curious.
I think after more than half of them develop it, the experiment is ended
Yeah,
because it does take slightly different amounts of time depending on how your like body processes what you're eating.
yeah,
So after enough of them develop it, the experiment is ended. I think there's some records of what the prisoners thought, and it was like a terrible experience for them. Like it was really not like done well. And this was like a really awful thing for them to experience. But it was also like a thing a lot of prisoners actually wanted to be involved in but couldn't be. So there's like a really difficult tension there.
yeah. Thank you so much. That's really interesting. That's why we, we have you come and tell us what you discovered. Um, Carter, when you were talking, you said a couple of things that were really interesting. Just because we don't always hear people talking about class as part of their analytical framework. And the two things that sort of caught my mind. You said, this type of religion for people like her, and it sort of beg the question, if you could talk a little bit about the sort of the class system in an asylum and maybe how religion may have been sort of charged in different ways as you move around that structure.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting topic. And I could go on this whole thing about like Anglicanism around the English Civil War, which is where some of this stuff actually starts as a class sort of system. And Episcopalianism, for those that may not know, comes off of it's a sort of an American branch for a while of the Anglican Church, which is the Church of England, right? When we have the Revolutionary War, the Anglican Church sort of ceases to exist, but there's still people that are interested in that kind of mode of religion, and so it comes back a little bit later as Episcopalianism. And a lot of the wealthy people in the South, as I mentioned, in the upper classes, the two big religions were Episcopalianism and Presbyterianism. And these are kind of class signifiers because Episcopalianism, like Anglicanism, is very supportive, as you would imagine, of a tradition that sort of reinforces a monarchy, right? Very supportive of class structure, right? Of the hierarchy as it is. It's like, stay where you are. That's where God put you, and so for people that are of an upper class position, this is very comforting because it justifies their class position and implies that they deserve it, that God has said they earned it, right? Rather than taking money from someone else or exploiting enslaved workers or anything like that, that their wealth is actually a reflection of God's will for them, right? And so, so Episcopalianism becomes a very popular religion just among the upper classes in general. Presbyterianism, again, also is, particularly in the upper South and in North Carolina and Virginia in particular, because of the Southern aristocracy there. They just have a close connection to Presbyterianism. Presbyterianism is connected with the Church of Scotland, but also ends up having a sort of, it comes out of the Church of England in many ways as well. So in the context of the asylum, to get back to that, and I don't mean to speak too long on this, but it's just very interesting. What we end up seeing is sort of a two-tiered system in a way, to oversimplify things a little bit, but between what are considered to be socially acceptable, like sort of mainstream Protestant denominations, Episcopalianism, more old school Presbyterianism. There is some sort of Presbyterianism that becomes a little bit more associated with revivals that's very much pushed away by the elite classes. And sometimes in certain contexts, we may have Quakerism, Congregationalism up north and stuff like that. That's also considered socially acceptable. But then these new enthusiastic, revival traditions are very much seen as lower class, in part because they don't have the same degree of self-control. People are going to these revivals and fainting and, screaming and wailing on the ground. And also one of the other things is they're associating not just in mixed gender congregations, but also oftentimes in mixed race congregations out in the woods, which makes the upper classes very uncomfortable because it sort of implies bad things to them, especially with white women. And so basically what they end up arguing is that this sort of enthusiasm, that they call it religious enthusiasm or religious excitement, is a sign of not just being lower class, but also being mentally deficient, right? That there's something wrong with you if you are willing to participate in these kind of events. If you start doing the flailing and the shrieking and stuff, it's not just that it's like impolite and kind of not nice. It's that it's also a sign of mental failure, which you can kind of see the grounds of eugenics there, that eventually that becomes something they want to purge out, right? But for a while, the idea is that you can change their religious affiliation, you can make them into respectable individuals modeled after the upper classes in the asylum, and that helps. So hopefully that answers that question there. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. So let me see if we have any. While I look, do you guys have any questions for each other?
I do have a question for Emily, actually, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So, and it's actually about class, which, I mean,
Sure.
representative of that, I guess. So I know you mentioned that Goldberger sees pleasure as an issue of wealth and not race, biological race, as the sort of trigger point here. But it seems to me like it's not so much that even though he recognizes poverty as an issue, it's not that he sees the issue as a matter of wealth distribution, but as a matter of behavior, right? That it's not that the poor people just don't have enough money and we should give them some more money and that will fix the problem, right? But that if they behave better, maybe, or they ate better, right? Maybe they would be more suited to working harder and therefore having a better class position. Is that sort of what's going on here, or does he have any sort of like conception of wealth redistribution at all?
Mhm. So I think there's kind of two things. Goldberger is probably the only person I found across every chapter I've worked on who does kind of have a concept of wealth redistribution. Like he doesn't think of it that way, but he wants to destroy the Southern cotton economy. He thinks the Southern cotton economy is the source of all evils here. It is causing all of these problems. It is harming these communities, and it is keeping them in this like perpetual like state of economic subservience. He actually does have like a very big structural problem. Every other public health person working in the period is kind of like, but people could be choosing to eat different things with the money they have. Like that's kind of a common one. Especially northern public health workers are often like, well, up here we don't have this problem even among poor people because we don't eat corn. And corn is like there's like a civilization tier list of staple grains, and corn is not at the top, right? And it's actually true that like any other staple grain, like wheat, rice, or potatoes, won't cause pellagra. And also, if you eat nixtamalized corn like they do in the Southwest, you also won't get pellagra. It makes the vitamin B more like bioavailable. Um, so Goldberger's the only one who seems to have the concept of redistribution, but there's no political force to it. That's kind of like what he's personally writing about in his correspondence. It doesn't often make it into his like published materials. It's like kind of there, but like he knows he can't do this. Like he has no force here. The US Public Health Service is not nearly powerful enough. And so it's interesting that the solution that ends up being applied and ends up being more popular is I think the one you name, which is like just telling people they're bad and wrong for what they're eating. Like and they're backwards and like the South is backwards because it eats this like bad food products. Um and the Southern diet is like really heavily racialized too, which is why it was really surprising to me how little Goldberger is doing that. But obviously, there's moments where that comes through, like what the Mississippi governor is talking about, what newspapers are talking about. They're often like, Black communities that eat a lot of corn should be really careful right now. Not to mention that, like, poor white communities are eating virtually the same diet because they are really in the same economic condition. So, yeah, it's kind of the interesting point of this chapter that's made some of this difficult because I really expected it to be like very racialized. I didn't expect him to kind of gesture to this redistributive aspect at all, you know.
One of the things that you had mentioned when you were talking about Goldberger and his work was he was going into these segregated white institutions. Did he actually observe Black life and Black diets and manifestations of disease, or did he just make assumptions about a poor white diet would naturally sort of transfer this same situation, the same biological problems?
Hey Matt, I'm sorry. We have some questions in the Q&A.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We jump to those first. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, obviously. Sorry, I uh can't see it. Do you want to, can you read them?
I can read. I'm gonna very quickly, because there's two, but very quickly, the first one is, did the government intervention of the Sioux Reservation help with the TB numbers?
Well, no. The short answer is no. So David Jones, a historian who's talked about this, kind of describes their work as like a treadmill to nowhere. They're incapable of learning from their past mistakes and they're doing the same thing over and over again. He kind of describes it as like amnesia, like that they don't realize they're doing the same thing over and over again. I think they're doing the same thing over and over again on purpose. I think they believe if this community can be surveilled enough, if they can put enough people on the ground in the homes, stopping people from making traditional foods, stopping them from doing this stuff. I think they believe very earnestly it would work. Like these people, in as much as they're very patronizing and patriarchal, and to like Carter's presentation, often described in the language of like like an actual father, right? Like that's really common in Native American like relations with the US government. They do care and they don't want these people to be dying. So I think this is like an earnest attempt at a solution that they believe if this community will simply do what they ask, it will eventually work out. Um, that doesn't happen, and it kind of takes until the 1950s and like the availability of antibiotics for this to actually work. So,
And then the second one, I know we're wrapping up. I will put the CLE credit link in the chat. And if anyone has time to stick around for just a few minutes, Carter and Emily, are you okay to answer
Yeah,
the question?
and y'all can also find, at least me and Emily, you may have yours, my email. If you go to the Religious Studies website and you look up the graduate students there, you can find my face, and my email is there, and you're welcome to reach out with any questions if you have that there. Yeah.
mhm.
Thanks, y'all. Yeah, and the next question is really good for both of you. Maybe Carter, we start with you since Emily, you had the next question. But can you describe how you identified that Wilson Library had materials central to your research, or
Yeah,
found materials
yeah,
that shaped the direction?
absolutely. So it was all really coincidental and exciting, actually, which is how the best sort of research is sometimes. I was actually working with Bobby Allen in the American Studies department. He works more with the public health department now, oftentimes. But he was doing some research on the North Carolina Insane Asylum, and that's where I came across Anna Cameron Kirkland. I just happened to be taking a class with him. So I came across her work there, learned about her association with the North Carolina Insane Asylum and later in Stanton, Virginia, and knew that some of the records were here at the Wilson. Same thing actually happened with the Mordecai situation. So I was actually just recommended a book from a gentleman on my committee, Jakob Ariel, on the Mordecais, and I found Caroline in there and was so delighted to see that not only were their families intermarried, which was kind of wild, but also that the Mordecais had extensive papers at the Wilson as well. So part of it also involves just going back and looking at the footnotes and stuff as well, which when you get to this level of research at the PhD level is a thing that you do a lot, right? Because you want to know, some people have done the work for you already. You want to go through, and when you like what they're talking about, go through and find where they found their stuff and then go look at it. That's what I did.
Yeah, I'm afraid at this point in my career, I read every historical work as sort of bibliography. It's
Yeah,
not so.
absolutely.
Mhm. Yeah, that actually really aligns with what I did. It just ended up being that one of my PhD advisors, former advisees, um, did her entire dissertation on pellagra, and I knew she had won a fellowship to go to the Wilson, so I'm like, surely they have something there. And I looked it up, and I was right. You know, there were materials that would be useful. I will also commend like the finding aids were very easily searchable and usable, which is not true of every archive I've been to. So that was really, really helpful in clarifying what I was going to use. So,
And the staff is lovely.
yeah.
You have to, as we're here with them, but it's really true. They're really lovely and very helpful there.
Mhm.
Thank you. They
Definitely.
are. It's nice that everybody's always excited when fellows come. It's really interesting. Well, do we have any more questions, Nadia? Looks like we're a little bit past time.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. I guess we're going to stick around for a second, just to make sure it titled things up. Everybody else has the CLEs. So I guess we'll see you next month when we're going to be talking on, let me get my notes out here. We'll be talking on March 11th. We're going to have two fellows again. We'll have Raquel Douglas from Brown University, Black Soul and Soil, the Freedom Dreams of North Carolina Black Farmers. And then we'll have Wakia Abdul Karim from NYU, and he's writing on ecological dispossession and the commodification of land, the legacy of enslaved labor and environmental transformation in the South Carolina Low Country. So that should really be interesting as well. It's always kind of a wealth of you always hope the fellowships are going to be interesting, and they always are. All right.
Thank you all for coming out as well, everybody here.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you so much for setting this up.